Most people remember Henry VIII as the overweight monarch with 6 wives and his own church. But behind the portraits and royal titles was something far darker. A man whose body, mind and soul slowly corroded in front of his court. In his final years, Henry wasn't the mighty figure painted in history books. He was a collapsing empire of flesh. So large he required mechanical help just to stand. His waist stretched to 54 inches. His body tipping the scales near 400 pounds, in a time when the average man weighed barely over 100. But the true horror wasn't his size. His legs were a battlefield of infected ulcers that oozed and stank so terribly that courtiers covered their noses when he passed. Some said the smell could reach through walls. Servants dreaded their duty so much they gambled to decide who would dress him each morning. Doctors today suspect his downfall began in 1536, when a jousting accident left him unconscious for hours, long enough to change him forever. That head injury might explain the violent mood swings and paranoia that consumed him. Add to that a likely hormonal disorder, and you get the explosive temper, the insatiable hunger, and the wounds that refused to heal. None of his physicians dared speak the truth. To suggest the king was ill was to risk your life, and as Henry's body decayed, so did his dignity. Unable to walk far, relying on custom-made chairs, and often losing control of himself, the man who demanded worship could barely command his own frame. Henry's 6 wives have become rhyme and trivia. Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. But that tidy summary hides a nightmare. Anne Boleyn was condemned on false charges, her supposed lovers tortured until one confessed. Before she met the executioner, she was forced to watch 5 men, including her brother, die because of lies her husband created. Then came Catherine Howard, barely out of girlhood. When her past relationships were revealed, Henry's pride became law. He declared it treason for any woman to marry him without confessing her sexual history. She was executed soon after. Catherine of Aragon spent her last days in isolation, barred from seeing her daughter, accused of madness, and left to die alone while Henry ignored her final letters. Anne of Cleves avoided the axe only by agreeing to pretend her marriage never happened, signing away her crown in exchange for her life. Jane Seymour, who bore him a son, died from childbirth, and Henry was courting again before her coffin cooled. These women weren't wives. They were hostages trapped in royal ceremony, with no way out but death or submission.
Henry didn't dine like a king. He devoured like a man trying to fill an emptiness no power could satisfy. His meals reached nearly 5,000 calories a day, twice what even a laborer would consume. By then he could barely move, but still demanded endless platters of meat, rich pies, and sugared treats. It was gluttony turned ritual. Excess made royal.
Henry VIII didn't just eat a lot. He turned eating into an empire. A normal feast for him looked like the aftermath of a battlefield. A whole roasted pig, several chickens, piles of fish, towers of bread, and oceans of wine. His kitchens weren't just busy, they were industrial. 200 staff worked around the clock, producing more than 800 dishes every day, all for the royal household. Henry himself would taste dozens of them, as if sampling his kingdom one bite at a time. But it wasn't only the amount that was strange. It was the logic behind it. Henry believed food carried power. Swan would supposedly make him graceful, venison would sharpen his hunting skill, and oysters, well, he thought they'd make him more vigorous with his wives. He devoured these like potions, convinced he could eat his way to greatness. The ritual around his meals bordered on obsession. Every dish passed through several food tasters, each risking their life before the king lifted a spoon. And even then, Henry made them wait half an hour after tasting, just to be sure they didn't drop dead from slow-acting poison.
Dinner wasn't a meal. It was theater. Courtiers gathered to watch their decaying ruler eat for hours, 4 at a time, while he worked through enough food to feed a small town. No one dared react to the grotesque spectacle. Certain foods were banned from his court, not for health reasons, but because he saw them as peasant fare. Turnips, barley, and other staples of common life were outlawed at his table, though they were far healthier than the mountains of meat and sugar that were killing him. Even as his body collapsed under its own weight and the pain of infection, Henry refused restraint. He believed royalty made him immune to consequence, as if divine right extended to digestion. Henry's paranoia didn't stop at his plate. It devoured his entire empire. By his final years, the king trusted no one. He turned his palaces into fortresses and his court into a nightmare. He slept beside loaded crossbows, daggers tucked under his pillow, and guards stationed in his chamber, watching him breathe through the night. Every palace was redesigned for escape. Secret corridors twisted through walls and floors so he could vanish if assassins came. Peepholes let him spy on his courtiers. Even the meeting rooms were bugged. Primitive listening holes hidden in the walls so Henry could hear whispers that weren't meant for him. His paranoia reached such heights that he built an entire spy network, and then a second one to spy on the first. Nobody in court knew who was loyal or who was reporting. Every conversation could be fatal. The same fear infected his dining halls. The kitchens became high-security zones, sealed off and guarded. Each ingredient, water, salt, spices, was tested by different people, all to prove it wasn't poisoned. Meals became military operations. And even his children weren't safe. He had agents shadow his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, convinced they were plotting to overthrow him, even as little girls. Eventually, Henry's paranoia turned preemptive. People were executed not for betrayal, but for the idea that they might betray him someday. The Tower of London overflowed with prisoners whose only crime was existing near the king at the wrong moment. Fear became contagious. Nobles spied on nobles. Servants betrayed masters. Everyone whispered, everyone watched, and nobody slept soundly. Because the only thing more dangerous than Henry's enemies was his imagination. Even after his death, the chaos didn't end. His paranoia had infected England itself, a legacy of suspicion that outlived the man who created it. By the end, Henry was so large he could no longer walk. Servants had to move him around on a special contraption fitted with wheels and pulleys, more machine than throne. Every movement was a grim ordeal. Chunks of decaying flesh from his infected legs would literally drop onto the palace floor as they carried him, and attendants trailed behind with cloths to collect what was left of the king. His body had swollen beyond recognition. The skin stretched tight and glossy, his wounds oozing, the air around him foul enough to drive even his doctors from the room. They'd seen horror before. This was worse. No one wanted to get close enough to confirm when he finally stopped breathing. Death offered no dignity. The royal embalmers, faced with his bloated body, wrapped it in lead and sealed it inside layers of wood, hoping to contain what was already rotting. It didn't work. As the funeral procession made its way from London to Windsor, the gases inside Henry's body built up until the coffin itself burst open. The lining split, and what remained of the once great king spilled out, coating the interior of the hearse with rot and stench. The procession stopped. Servants scrubbed at the mess with rags and buckets while the smell choked the air. And if that weren't grotesque enough,
Witnesses later swore they saw dogs licking at the remains that had seeped from the coffin. The self-proclaimed ruler by divine right ended up as a feast for strays on an English road. Even burying him proved nearly impossible. The coffin, swollen, lead-lined and enormous, was so heavy that the ground kept collapsing beneath it. Workers had to widen and deepen the grave again and again just to keep it from caving in. But the trouble didn't stop after burial. For years, strange noises and foul odors were reported coming from Henry's tomb. Some whispered it was his ghost. More likely, it was the king himself, still decomposing beneath the church floor, gases continuing to escape from what was left of him. Several of the attendants who handled his body didn't live long after the ordeal, possibly infected by the very rot they tried to bury. So there it is, the real Henry VIII, not the regal figure from paintings or the charming monarch of legend, but a man who decayed in both body and mind. A king who devoured everything, food, wives, servants, a kingdom, until he was consumed by his own corruption. A man so eaten alive by greed and fear that even death couldn't silence his chaos. His so-called legacy, the Church of England, his 6 doomed marriages, is only part of the story. The rest is a warning. Absolute power doesn't just destroy kingdoms, it destroys the human being who wields it.